We are on the road. Rugby World Cup 1987. But this story is so much more than just this first event. We not only need to understand the greater context of rugby to grasp what was transpiring in 1987, but we can also understand where we've come from and even where we're heading to as we enter this 2023 event in France. Le Tour, as I called it, tentatively called it, I might add, in the opening, shortened version of what should be a lengthening series. As I prepared and thought and considered 1987 and the Rugby World Cup that was, as one who not only watched but attended and who has subsequently engaged with everyone following 87, it has led me to look at the beginning of rugby, to read through some wikis on the subject, and to have, I guess, my view of the importance and import of Rugby World Cup into this code's orbit has been elevated and enriched, because so, as I stop at this intersection, it's an opportune time to head back to, well, before we were all around, and it is 1886, if you will. Scotland, Wales and Ireland decide to form the International Rugby Football Board. Now you may notice one name that you may expect to be there but is missing, and that is of course England, the nation that contained rugby school and the place where William Webb Ellis picked up the ball and ran with it. Now the reason that is the case is previous to 1886, I believe it's in 1885, a disputed try between England and Scotland didn't go down very well with either nation, and so after writing letters to each other, yes, no social media back in those days, no ability to send it out and to tweet about it or post about it or provide some other engagement on it, they sent letters to each other. England were not part of that initial engagement in 1886 when the IRFB came into being. It would be the next year where I think certain letters or where the outworking of that really began. It wouldn't be long before England would come on board in 1890, and so these four nations, member nations you could say, of the International Rugby Football Board. In 1949, post the World War, New Zealand, Australia and South Africa would come on board and become members, and in 1978 France would become a full member, and there you have 8 member nations that made up a rugby universe, which, when you consider that reality, is rather small. When you consider where we're at today, seems somehow unbelievable. And so when the 87 event came into being, you had a couple of questions and quandaries. South Africa, under the apartheid system, wasn't going to be part and wouldn't be involved, so that made 7. And how or where are you going to find the other nations? Of course, others had been involved with a rugby code, but invitations would be sent out. There was some controversy because Western Samoa was not invited, and another Pacific Island nation like Tonga was, even though Western Samoa was had a better record probably. It was stronger in terms of its representation. USSR was invited but turned it down based on certain political equations. And so 16 nations, 7 nations of the International Rugby Football Board, minus the 8th, South Africa, 9 other nations descended on New Zealand and Australia, who were hosting the 87 event. And it would unleash and unlock a new beginning for a rugby code. I'll pause that at this point as I begin to bring in both a personal and a rugby or an All Black rugby context. I had been domesticated in the North Island for all my years until 87 would dawn, and New Plymouth had been our most recent home, which is on the west coast, on the hip of the North Island. New Plymouth would probably be my rugby high point as we won some type of championship. I can't remember if it was New Plymouth or Taranaki, excuse me, but Dave Loveridge, the ex-All Black halfback, presented us with the spoils of war. And so when the Rugby World Cup arrived into my world, I had just been moved south to Christchurch on the eastern coast of the South Island. I went down as a staunch North Islander, ready to share my enlightened view of sporting worlds and rugby code, and share it with those in the red and black. And obviously they were most appreciative of the insight and all the wisdom I had accrued. Indeed. So early on it was plenty of talk and plenty of, well, offside we could say, plenty of whistles blown, but eventually I would convert to Cantabrianism and haven't removed the eye patch or tracking code since. So Rugby World Cup entered my world as I entered a new world down the South Island. In terms of a rugby code in New Zealand, the 80s were a turbulent period, and mostly because of our engagement and our connection with South Africa, our close connection, an embrace that still continues to this day as you see the sun shining in on my right side. If you're a rugby purist or a traditionalist, you'll know about the 81 tour to New Zealand and the impact that tour had in terms of our rugby consciousness, in terms of our social consciousness. It exposed our world in Aotearoa, our idyllic, our sort of set apart, kept away from the rest of the naughty world, and in our climes we had it pretty good, and yet 81 we perceived that way. I perceived that way as a young boy anyway, and 81 exposed the friction and fractures not only in the world of ideas and the world of politics, but in even right down to the personal and the family. And you saw it. It was before you on rugby fields around our nation as people expressed their disdain, expressed their disagreement, expressed their anger at what was transpiring in our homeland in light of what was happening in South Africa. And so that tour was pretty tumultuous. I have an intersection as a young boy, of course, unaware really of all that was going on. My father would take me along to the training run in 81 at Rotorua, and I would meet a blonde-headed inside back. I'm sure you can put two and two together there and guess who that individual is, and talk after the fact. It sort of highlighted how that was a pretty special training run because of the lack of protest. So maybe the one time that it would have come or arrived into my consciousness, even as a young boy, therefore it didn't happen. And so 81 came and went. 85 arrived, and the All Blacks wanted a tour of the Republic. Court injunction meant that anything official couldn't happen. 86, and an unofficial tour happens. Individuals head to the Republic, all but 2 of the national team, and they become the Cavaliers and have a full tour of the Republic. Pretty unsuccessful at the elite level, you could say, if I could describe it as such. And in my own world, my dad and I remember one particular visit to the local video store for a VHS cassette tape of a match from the tour. I'm not sure if it came in officially or through what means, but there it was, and highlights where rugby was in terms of our orbit, in terms of how we viewed our cultural life under the sun, and rugby being a significant part of what transpired. My dad was a pretty successful rugby player. Who knows what would have been, but in his middle 20s, when he just made a provincial squad, he dislocated his shoulder 5 times. And so with the stuffed shoulder, he had to give the game away and move on to other endeavours. And so the All Blacks now had to deal with the consequences of the Cavaliers, and the Baby Blacks in 86 were a part of the reality, as the players received 2 match punishments or bans. And I remember when I was up in New Plymouth watching the Baby Blacks on TV when they were playing in Christchurch, and all these new names, and you wondered even at that age whether or not this would impact on the All Blacks. And I know in that test match at least they were pretty successful, and so it didn't seem to hurt us as much. And eventually a number would be reintegrated with this All Black side. And when 87 came about and this World Cup came about, the All Blacks were ready for action. Probably fair to say that the All Blacks and the Australians were the favourites and will be battling it out. Home ground advantage, of course. And that was the personal and the rugby sort of context happening in Aotearoa. But the larger, I guess you say the larger rugby world, the larger rugby universe had been pretty limited. And so when 87 came about, and those limited number of member nations, those that were invited, it explains why it was such an eye-opening event for me as a young person. My memory of rugby is playing these major nations. I mean, the reality is how rugby was formed. You played those other members. And I have fond memories, even past that period, of tours, and especially to Wales and the Valleys, and playing these teams that seemed to have names that were spelt one way and pronounced another way. And early mornings getting out with my father, and that would continue as Rugby World Cup would head north as well, and as tour matches still continue, although mostly at the elite level. And so when Rugby World Cup came about, my horizons were broadened. A rugby shape grew, and a sporting shape grew as a result. Rugby went from being the procurer of a certain number of nations connected with the United Kingdom, colonials, and started to become intercontinental. It's interesting because when you consider this fact here, that from 87, I think it's to 99, 80 more member nations become part of the International Rugby Football Board, which I believe that stayed its name until 1998, when it became the International Rugby Board, and then in 2014 when World Rugby became the name, brand, descriptive title for what this body represented. Again, we see the connections there, how football, and that's why a lot of people talk about rugby as footy. It was part of it. I mean, football was, again, there is a relationship there. I mean, if we go right back to the beginning and what had transpired just post England becoming a member of the International Rugby Football Board. There was, I believe they called it the Great Schism, because the lurking head of professionalism reared as rugby went into the northern cities and working class individuals had to take time off. But they were working, so how were they going to be remunerated? And therefore rugby league. We see how, I mean, there's nothing new under the sun in one sense, and how the connection between these sporting codes and the relationships that have formed, and how the translation between one to the other becomes a reality. So 87 is such that it took rugby from what you could say a very regional and parochial type sporting culture, and placed it on a platform and said to the world, come and join us. We are now a sporting idea that is beyond just a select and small group of friends. And so that has just grown since. And if you're looking at the 2023 event, then the status of rugby and the status of a Rugby World Cup comes from that early beginning, and is morphed because of what was happening, or what happened in 87, and what those individuals who committed to it, what they've given to a rugby legacy. And so now football, the Olympics, and then rugby, I think that's the order of events in terms of world sporting stages. And rugby it's happened very recently. We see it hasn't been long. I mean, you consider that it was only the late part of the 20th century that football was given the heave-ho, and so we see how rugby in one sense has increasingly found its feet. And we talk about professionalism, talk about it back in 1893. Well, it would be 1995, 1996 when any type of, shamateurism, as it was often termed, because of the fact of amateurs and the shamateur being exposed for what I guess it was, a bit of a false reality, as players from our neck of the woods would head north and for a working time, of course. And it came out in the late 90s. Rugby World Cup 87, now the event. What do I remember of the event? What of the event? Well, I've given you some indication of the nations involved. And that explains, when I think about who was invited, why I don't really remember too much of the round robin matches. They were quite one-sided. And this is a first step. This is not the mature or maturing version that we see in 2023. It's more the knockout matches and the matches that happened at the end of the tournament that stick in my memory bank. And it's also through a couple of VHS cassette tapes, that I recorded because I wanted to keep a record of this special time. And so for the final, I recorded and made sure that I'd used 2 tapes, but I'd made sure that I got the whole lot. And then there was a 2-hour special after the fact, which was like a magazine of the tournament and recorded various things around it. I remember the track they used, the Final Countdown by Europe, and that has stayed in my memory, and stood to my attention at the time. Some 80s rock for you there. And the first match, well, there are certain matches I do remember. The first match is one of them. I remember the scoreline. What? 70 odd points? When does that happen in our rugby world? I remember the opposition, remembering the 7 or the 8 nations that we played, and Italy wasn't a part of that. And even while there may have been connections with individuals, and there may have been matches historically between other nations outside that reality, for my young person, this was a new thing. And it was intriguing. And it opened up new doors, fresh opportunities about what would be into a rugby world as I turn off. And we would be exposed to teams from different continents, teams that we hadn't seen, or nations even, that we hadn't seen. And they showed different parts, different styles of rugby, and that comes out in something that happens later. But that first match, Michael Jones, now immortalised in statue at Eden Park, stretching out, John Kerwin's try from the end of the world, and the one-man wrecking crew through the heart of the Italian defence, so strong and so powerful. And the comment from the Italian captain surrounding it, talking about Jock Hobbs, and I was like, Michael Jones is the man, not Jock Hobbs. And he celebrated Jock Hobbs as maybe being the ideal shape of a rugby player. So that's one I definitely remember. Others are related to that 2-hour highlights package, maybe. I remember things for reasons not necessarily related to the contest. I do remember watching Richard Zimba and the try he scored, where he put the ball down and sort of did a roly-poly but did a shoulder in. I remember that because I think they lost in the end. It was against another lesser nation. I remember that. I remember many of the quarterfinals. I remember the Wales and England match. I'm pretty sure that's a quarterfinal. I haven't actually looked it up, but I'm pretty sure that is. And I remember wanting one side to win. I remember Fiji and France, and I remember Corindua in his one hand, holding the ball in one hand. What other nation did that? Well, you may have got some flamboyant flair from the French, but even the All Blacks were, well, you know, stiff upper lip. You know, good on you, mate. And yes, we like to use the ball, but that type of Pacific Island exuberance and expression has really come about post 87 into my world, into a rugby world, and now are very much an important part of what transpires at a Rugby World Cup. I remember the All Blacks in Scotland, 30 points to 3, in a pretty cold and pretty drab Christchurch, Lancaster Park. And I remember because I did my paper run in the afternoon, and the All Blacks made it through. The semi-finals are probably where it begins to become stronger. Well, the All Blacks dominate Wales. The Welsh scrum's on roller skates going backwards. The All Blacks are dominant. The forward pack is in control. This is a side that is continuing to grow in strength, continuing to rise to the occasion. And maybe the most memorable part of the match isn't for anything really rugby. It's for Buck Shelford's straight right to Hugh Richards that puts him on the deck. He's out. And he's also given the heave-ho by the referee, which seems to, in some respects, to be quite surprising. And Buck Shelford stays on the field, even though Buck Shelford is delivering, you could say, rugby street justice. But the match that is the one that you would say is of the tournament, of Rugby World Cup 87, is remembered for one contest. And if you can see and capture one, it would be the semi-final. Both semi-finals were in Australia. The final was in New Zealand. And it's France versus Australia, excuse me. Australia are the favourites. And again, this cassette tape, this 2-hour highlights package, well, part of it is a camera on Alan Jones, the Wallabies coach. And he's there. And I don't know if it's the stress of the moment or just something that is habitual, but he's always fiddling with his tie and he's always moving his neck. Obviously the comfort levels aren't where he would want them to be, and so we watch him, and I think he has Brian Smith beside him. Yes, the Brian Smith that eventually played for Ireland as well, and a young Brian Smith. And it's fascinating. It's fascinating to watch a coach in that position because the match is pulsating. It is the match. It is tight, it is back and forward. Andrew Slacker's captain of the Wallabies. But I remember David Cody, and I remember the try he scored. And I remember him sort of flicking it up. He had the cowboy type persona. And I just remember him. He stands out in my memory bank. And it comes down right to the end. And I'm wanting France, of course. You know, I'm a Kiwi. I mean, come on. And France pull it out. I remember the celebration. I remember, did he knock it on? I think it's the number 8, the 8th man, Rodriguez, I think it is, from memory. And he puts his boot to the ball, and the ball sort of almost moves in his hands, but it's play on. And the ball finds the man out wide. And Serge Blanco, surgical, goes in the corner, on his knees, throws the ball forward. France are going to win. The upset has happened. And the moment, it is a rugby occasion, and one that sticks in my memory. And so, the next weekend, a week later, at Eden Park, the New Zealand All Blacks, playing at home, a neutral venue really, maybe in Rugby World Cup type parlance, are taking on France, Les Bleus, and there can only be one winner. The All Blacks win probably pretty easily. Again, Michael Jones scores. Kirk, David Kirk, Captain Kirk, he scores, and John Kerwin scores as well. From memory, I'm just like working through, I believe it's those three. Then David Kirk receives the William Webb Ellis Trophy. A couple of North Americans, I think it's Canadian hat behind him. How did they get in the stand? David Kirk invites Andy Dalton, who was going to be captain, but injury took him out. And the All Blacks, New Zealand, celebrate their national team winning the first Rugby World Cup. And it's a high point. We're celebrating down in Christchurch. It's new in a rugby orbit. It creates a new viewing point for how we will expect to see rugby played into the future. It may be 4 more years, but this is going to happen again, and rugby will never be the same. For the players, I mean, again, we see the changes that have happened, what the Rugby World Cup has done, and how that has probably, you could say, really encouraged professionalism, which happened 3 World Cups later. How that's impacted body types. The Rugby World Cup weight of the All Blacks, I think the prop forwards, the front row, they were in the 90 kg range. These were men who worked. A lot of them did physical jobs, which helped them to be able to be ready for the code and not have to spend time in a gym and train for something where they didn't have the time. Because again, we have an amateur. They're amateurs. And that means Monday, most of them are back on the job. Most of them are back at work and having to continue life as it is. Rugby is a favourite pastime, but it's still a pastime. And on my wall, I have a poster that says the All Blacks, yes, identifies them. They're all in this sort of 1980s lineup. And it says Rugby World Cup champions, 1987. They're not Rugby World Champions. They're only World Cup champions. And of course, that's changed. The way we talk about our rugby has changed. The way we talk about our World Cup champions has changed. And will that go under another iteration with a global test season? All these things, rugby world is unfolding. And it's unfolding at the foot of 1987 and what happened in New Zealand and Australia, which brought in a new player, a new dynamic, a new viewing lens, a new interpretive grid, and has only grown subsequently, where rugby now has a status and standing on all the continents of the world. And it has 1987 to thanks for it. That was one World Cup, the first World Cup, but that's just the first step. In this series, as we talk about the story so far, as we're ready for Le Tour maybe in 2023. I'm going to talk through my own experiences of a Rugby World Cup as it relates to an All Blacks orbit, but even the larger orbit. Because what would happen in 87 probably went to a next level in maybe 95 when South Africa returned. And then even increased in light of certain players in that tournament where it probably went global at that point. And other events or parts of a Rugby World Cup have impacted since. If you were around in 87, what are your memories? What are your recollections of what transpired? What stands tallest as you recount? I brought paraphernalia, a small mini rugby ball, a scarf, I think with Drop, who was the sort of the symbol or the emblem for that event, and also a bag. And I still have these things. These things are still significant in my shape. I still have the VHS cassette tapes, as I mentioned previously. I encourage you to share your own recollections and to consider, you know, what's transpired because of 87, because of a Rugby World Cup. Rugby went from a small part of a certain section of the world, just waving to a person for letting me through, and grew and has become a world game. That is Rugby World Cup 1987, done and dusted. I hope you've enjoyed this personal recollection and an insight, maybe even on the journey that was. Maybe you've seen some of those connections and can grasp how rugby has sort of arrived where it is even today, and as it continues to seek to grow and is asking other questions, you get the understanding and you begin to grasp that these are really recent conversations. These aren't long-term realities that have been with us for a number of generations. It is this generation, my generations, that has experienced a new beginning, and that will help to highlight and explain why certain questions are still being asked, why certain questions are still looking to be answered, and how best to come about, how best to answer these things in a rugby world. I encourage you, as I begin to wrap this up, to like and share this post, like and share this video even, to comment and to pass on your thoughts. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel, then please do, and please encourage others to subscribe. In the next coming days, then we will go through, we will find a Rugby World Cup that maybe includes you, if you're feeling like this is someone else's generation and this is someone else's story and this doesn't involve you. Well, it does very much involve you if you love a rugby world and are fascinated with a rugby code. This very much involves your story and the narrative of the game they tell us that is played in heaven. Well, I'm not necessarily going to give you any insight in that context. However, the way it's transpired on terra firma has been such that the years that have followed have only deepened and widened how we view and how we understand rugby union. And I look forward to sharing more of that story next time as we build towards 91 and a Rugby World Cup, which is very much around our neighbours in New Zealand, or our neighbour. We have more than one, of course, but our main neighbour in New Zealand. And I look forward to you joining me to make sure I don't crash, so I can get to that next time. Thank you for watching, and thank you for playing that part